This is the video for therapeutic exercises for the forearm. So first is the arm. First is the elbow flexion. So elbow flexion. I'm going to use my water bottle here, just for strengthening exercises of elbow flexion. You want to hold your shoulder in place, and you can bring your arm from a extended position up like this. So a bicep curl, that's strengthening for the elbow flexion. So this portion is the concentric. Holding it up here would be isometric, and then slowly controlled lowering it would be the eccentric. Now, this is an open chain strengthening exercise. With elbow flexion, there's actually also a closed chain exercise, which is the pull-up, the chin-up. So if you had a bar, so imagine the water bottle was the pull-up bar, and I was hanging from it, pulling my body up toward it and getting my chin over it would be the closed chain, because the distal segment stays still, and the proximal segment is what moves toward moves around the pivot. Now, next is elbow extension. So strengthening exercise for the elbow extension are what we may call bend over tricep. Open chain strengthening exercise is the bent over bicep tricep extension. So I'm here with my the top portion of my arm, so where my biceps are parallel to the ground, and I'm extending out like this and lowering. So this is the concentric. Holding it up here is the isometric, and then slowly controlled lowering it down would be the eccentric. Now this is open chain. Closed chain tricep strengthening exercise is also, you can also use the push-up. So I like to use the diamond push-up for tricep because it targets the triceps more. So I put my hands on the ground together, forming sort of a diamond or a triangle push-up, whichever you prefer, close grip push-up, and then I lie flat like this, so keeping my body in a nice straight line so that I'm pushing as much of my body weight as I can, keeping my elbows tucked in and then pushing away. So this would be the eccentric portion of the movement. This would be the isometric, and then pushing away would be the concentric. Next is elbow supination. So with elbow supination, my palm would be facing the ground, and I would hold maybe a long pole or a dumbbell, but ideally you want to be using something with weight if you're using your right arm, with weight on the left side. And so as you turn it over, you're working your supinator muscles. And so this would be the concentric portion, and then holding it in supinated position would be the holding it. So I actually, from here to here would be where gravity is working around the bottle, because the bottle's fulcrum, the bottle's weight is up here. And so as you pull, this is the concentric. Holding it here would be the isometric, and then slowly lowering it back to that pronated would be the eccentric. Now, pronation would be the other way. So you'd start in a supinated position, and coming up to straight would be the concentric, and then holding it here would be the isometric, because gravity works strongest when the bottle is flat out, and then slowly lowering it down to that position would be the eccentric. Next is ulnar deviation, or wrist flexion. So with wrist flexion, what I'm looking to do is holding my elbow completely still. So for my forearm is still, and the water bottle is moving around the wrist, so the weight is moving around the wrist. So this is wrist flexion. So from this position up to here would be the concentric. Holding it here would be isometric because, again, gravity works when the bottle's here, not directly over the wrist. And then slowly releasing down to that position would be the eccentric. Now, with elbow extension, wrist extension, you turn your palm down and let the bottle hang with your wrist flexed, and then coming up to extending that bottle, the weight up would be the concentric, slowly lowering it down would be the eccentric, and holding it in that straight, wrist straight position would be the isometric strengthening. And then finally we have ulnar and radial deviation. So what I'm going to use is a band here. So what I'm going to do is put my hand flat down facing forward like this. You can have your elbow slightly bent. I'll put the band around this way so that it's pulling medially toward me. And then as I create tension on the band and as I pull my hand away from me, since we are in a pronated position, that would be ulnar deviation because I would be pulling toward my ulna. So that's how you do the concentric strengthening of ulnar deviation. Holding it in that position would be isometric strengthening, and then slowly bringing it back would be the eccentric. Right? Now, to do radial deviation, you can just turn your hand out. So face, instead of your palm facing forward, your palm faces out. So you're in a very close to the anatomical position with your hands supinated. Put the band in the same way, and now when I pull out this way, I'm pulling toward my radius, therefore it's radial deviation. So ideally here, we want to keep the elbow completely fixed. And so we pull out just like that. That's the concentric. Holding it out there would be the eccentric, the isometric, and then slowly lowering it back would be the isometric. Right. Now to stretch the wrist flexors, you would put your wrist in wrist extension. And so what this will look like is pulling your hand back towards you. So you can use a band if you need to. You can put the band down toward, so you can face your palm down toward the ground with your fingers, and then pull the band back. Oh, the band kind of gave up on me there. So with the band pulling away toward the back of your hand, pull, and that would be, and flex at the wrist, keeping that forearm nice and straight. That would give you your wrist flexor stretch. Now, in order to stretch the wrist extensors, you would put your hand into wrist flexion, deep wrist flexion, in order to stretch your wrist extensors, just like this. You can also stretch your wrists on the ground. What you can do is place your hand palm flat on the ground and lean forward to get a good wrist flexion, so your wrist flexors stretch, right? Now you can turn instead of having your palm on the ground, you can have the back of your hand on the ground, just like this, with your palm facing up and your fingers pointing back. This is a little bit more of a painful stretch. So what you can do is pull your hands closer to your knees, and then extend your elbows, and then pull back to get into deep wrist flexion to get a good wrist extensor stretch. All right. Now with finger flexor stretch. So your finger flexors are right here. So this is finger flexion right there. So if you want to stretch that, you want to put your fingers into excessive extension. So, not necessarily excessive, but as far back as they'll go. So putting pressure right here on the knuckles and then pulling back with your fingers. So put your thumb on your knuckles, pull back with your fingers to get a good finger flexor stretch. Now, to stretch the finger extensors, you'd do the opposite. So you'd bend your fingers around the knuckles here. You'd bend down, so kind of like you're about to crack your knuckles. You could stretch them just like that. All right, thank you for watching.